Good morning and welcome to this showcase webinar organised on behalf of the NERC's Environmental Risk to Infrastructure Innovation Programme, or the ERIP programme. My name is Owen Jenkins of Syria, and our team here provides support to the NERC in delivering this programme, particularly in terms of industry brokerage and dissemination. The programme has awarded 50 projects covering a range of environmental impacts and a very wide range of industry sectors. A database with information on all these projects is accessible at syria.org/NERC. Before we start, just a few words on how we'll be running the webinar. If you have any problems during the course of the webinar, connecting or hearing whatever, please send us a message via the chat facility. We have planned a question and answer session at the very end of the webinar. Could you please submit your questions throughout using the question box. Please state if you wish to direct your question to a particular speaker or a general question for discussion. The topic of today's seminar, multi-hazards, was one of three themes identified right at the beginning of the ERIP programme almost 5 years ago. However, the number of projects looking at this topic has been fairly limited, so the industry members on ERIP suggested NERC commissioned BGS to undertake a review of industry and academic practice in this area to inform the way forward. Roxana and Joel from BGS will be providing a summary of the outcome of this project. After their presentation, we will try to run a short online poll session to get a snapshot of your thoughts on multi-hazards with a view to possibly arranging a workshop-style event later in the year. After the poll, we'll be followed by three summaries of 3 ERIP projects on multi-hazards that have been commissioned. Just to clarify in terms of timing, all the presentations will be 15 minutes, other than the BGS presentation, which will be 20 minutes. And as I said, the questions will be at the very end. 217 people have registered for today's meeting, including representatives from infrastructure and property owners, local authorities, environmental and industry sector regulators, consultants, commercial and insurance interests, and of course universities and other research bodies. Finally, a recording of this webinar will be available on the ERIP website shortly after the meeting. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce Hugo Winter of EDF Energy, who will provide an industry overview on multi-hazards and its importance to infrastructure. And Hugo is also a member of the ERIP group. Over to you, Hugo.
Thanks, Owen. So, hello, as Owen says, my name's Hugo Winter. I'm the manager of the Environment and Natural Hazards R&D team within the EDF Energy R&D UK Centre. So my presentation today will be a very short introduction. I just wanted to give a couple of words on EDF Energy and why we're interested in this particular topic, and then outline just briefly where, at least coming from an energy industry perspective, and a specific focus on maybe the nuclear industry, where the past work on multi-hazards has looked into, and a snapshot of a couple of different projects that are currently ongoing, with a view to obviously the projects that are being presented later on. So regarding EDF Energy, as many of you are probably aware, we're one of the biggest one of the big 6 energy providers in the UK, and the largest in terms of low carbon energy generation. So our infrastructure is based all around the UK. We have 8 current build nuclear power plants, and also many offshore wind farms as well. And also, as many are aware, the new build nuclear power plants at Hinkley Point C and Sizewell C. The team that I'm involved with in particular is focused on natural hazards in the environment. So here we have a real focus on safety, especially for the nuclear fleet, and also on reliability and operational performance. So our areas here, we're quite generalist. We look across a broad range of different natural hazards, providing support to the business. So whether that be kind of hazards that have already received a lot of attention, such as extreme rainfall, extreme wind speed and coastal flooding, through to slightly less well-known hazards such as volcanic ash, space weather, and marine biofouling by jellyfish and seaweed. So one of the topics that we're very interested in through our research program is hazard combinations. And that's what I'll talk about a little bit more through this talk. Okay, talking a little bit about the industry context. So as I said before, EDF Energy previously in the past been primarily nuclear focused. So I'll focus on the type of analyses that have done in this area on combinations of hazards, because I think they're a bit more mature than maybe other areas have been. So obviously any piece of energy infrastructure needs to have considered hazard combinations. I think that's clearly been illustrated by different events over the past few years, whether it be the Fukushima event in 2011 or the winter storms in the UK of 2013, 2014 or 2015, 2016. All of these events have not just seen the occurrence of one particular hazard, it's either been combinations of different hazards. So whether that be a triggering style relationship or compounding, and when the talk from BGS will go into that in a bit more detail later. From the practical perspective, really the focus at the moment is on kind of, I guess, two steps. There's always what I would call more of a screening step, and then at least for nuclear focus, there's always a probabilistic analysis step. So the screening step is really to look at combinations of hazards. So the very, very small picture on the right-hand side, which you won't be able to read fully, is an example of one of these big matrices that's been built up that shows a lot of different potential combinations of hazards. And basically, it's a big literature review that says, can these hazards occur together? Are there examples from academic literature, from industry literature, whether these occur together? Some hazards, due to physical constraints, it's probably impossible that they would occur. So really, firstly, there's this screening step to take this very large range of hazards and cut it down to a more manageable size. And then once we have those for our particular site of interest, then looking more at probabilistic analysis. So whether that be a joint probability analysis or other different types of approach. So there's lots of different research projects in the nuclear industry that have sought to develop these kind of big matrices. So I've listed three here: SAMHSA, Matrix, and NARCIS, which is ongoing at the moment. These are all Horizon 2020 EU projects. And really the focus of all these past projects has really been on the collecting of literature for the screening step, so doing the screening. So I'm just going to quickly mention a couple of projects that EDF have recently been involved with, which is kind of starting to look beyond this this screening step and kind of moving onwards. So we currently have a PhD ongoing at the moment, where the aim really is so what I was describing before, it was more like collecting literature on whether hazards can occur together. Now I think the next step is we're interested in how do we actually go model those multi-hazards, and then off the back of that, how do we then try and provide clear guidance to our end users, so that be our engineers. So if there's a particular issue that they face in the future, to know which models and which approaches are the best to use. So that's kind of the pictures here show on the left-hand side for triggered hazards and on the one on the right-hand side for compound hazards, where we've tried to split down the different methodologies that are used into stochastic, empirical, and mechanistic methods, and then trying to basically split for the different types of combinations of hazards. So again, the split here, you'll notice there's a lot of different methodologies here for analysing, and this is one of the difficulties, and I think one of the things that was pulled out of the report later from BGS that I'm sure they'll talk about is that there's a lot of different methods, and some of these methods are built up in very different areas. So you might have hydrologists saying one thing, industry practitioners using one particular method because it's the method that's always been used, and then in different areas, different methods. So that's what this work has tried to kind of list out, a lot of different methods. So the work that I'm describing, the paper's just been published, so it's kind of a big review on multi-hazard quantification methods. And then I guess next steps are on this is really starting to, what I've described before is really still looking at combinations of hazards, so 2 different hazards, whereas in reality, we might want to start looking ahead instead now to multi-hazard scenarios. So we know that hazards, again, they don't come as just one hazard, they don't come as just 2 hazards, they can come as a combination. So the example on the bottom right-hand side there is an example of what you might imagine for a storm event coming across the UK, where you're getting extreme wind speeds, extreme rainfall, also sea surge and extreme waves, and maybe some river flooding as well, all in combination. And really the key questions there are, how does that impact on infrastructure? And then if we want to actually quantify that, how do we put out, and that's kind of, in many situations, that's what we want to do in the nuclear context, is how do we actually create a sensible probability statement out of this? And then the other piece of work I very briefly wanted to mention just ahead of me finishing here was one called the ETI Natural Hazards Project. So this was a project which aimed to author a set of high quality peer-reviewed documents to summarize good practice for characterizing natural hazards. So the aim of this was to be consistent across natural hazards. So again, this was to try and stop the issue of people working in silos, developing different methodology. And the aim was to be accessible to end users. So there's several technical volumes here. There's 12 technical volumes here, supported by five case studies. Really focusing here, as in the bottom right-hand corner, on the hazard, not so much at this stage on the vulnerability and exposure aspects, but hopefully that'll be brought out in future work. And I really wanted to point towards, there was one particular volume here on combinations of hazards, which provided a first attempt. Again, the focus of this project, the research phase was done a few years ago, was on combinations of hazards. So there were 9 specific combinations of hazards, and again on methodologies. So this showed how you might use a joint probability analysis style approach to analyze particular different combinations. And then it shows how you would apply those methodologies at a site. So the site that was chosen was the Traw's Finnid site in Wales. So these documents can be downloaded for free at the IMechE website on the link on the bottom. So that's really where I wanted to end things, really. I mean, I hope I've shown you that at the moment there's certainly already a lot of work out there collecting lots of really interesting information on combinations of hazards. And alongside the work that BGS have done and will present, I think it's really a very interesting topic going forwards for research, especially practical research in kind of applied spaces. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugo. We always like to try to start these meetings with an industry perspective, and I think that was a good insight as to how your organisation is dealing with that. Let's move on now then to Paul Munday of WSP. We'll hand over the control of the screen to you, Paul, if you make sure you're unmuted, and over to you.
Thanks very much. I'm hopefully sharing my screen with you. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, over to you.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks very much. So I'm Paul Munday. I lead WSP's climate resilience business, and I'm here to talk to you about interacting risks specifically within the built environment and natural environments, and also infrastructure sectors. And this project specifically is in support of the UK's next climate change risk assessment, which of course is to be published in 2022. So usual kind of overview of what I'm going to talk about, a bit of background, why is this important, how are we doing this, and then some initial findings just based on some of the outputs that have been developed to date as well. So background then, apologies if I'm teaching some of you to suck eggs, but I think it kind of helps to set this project within the context of some of the UK work that's going on, of course. The UK, of course, through the Climate Change Act, has a cyclical reporting process that's centred around a national risk assessment and national adaptation programme, or NAP, every 5 years. So the primary role of the CCRA is to inform the UK government and its devolved administrations on the risks and opportunities requiring the most urgent responses, enabling government to set out objectives, proposals and policies for adapting to climate change. So the CCRA is also used to inform investment and policy decisions where climate change is a significant factor. And the CCRA process is also used, crucially, to show progression between each assessment as well. So of course we've had the first CCRA in 2012, the most recent and second one in 2017, and then the third one, as I mentioned, in 2022. So this project is specifically informing the next CCRA. The second CCRA, and most recent in 2017, highlighted areas for further research ahead of this third assessment, and this included the nature and extent of interacting climate change risks in the built and natural environment and infrastructure sectors, and that's of course the focus of this project. As I've mentioned, the findings from this project will inform the evidence report, and unlike CCRA 2, there will be no cross-cutting risks chapter. So effectively, the findings from this project will feed into each chapter on the interacting risks. So they won't be separated, which is a key difference in the next risk assessment. So what is an interacting risk? Owing to global drivers of change, including our increasing greenhouse gas emissions, the UK will experience sea level rise, hotter, drier summers, and also warmer, wetter winters. And of course, this is supported by the recently released UK CP18 projections and also the UK CP09 project that preceded it. These changes, of course, will result in both chronic and also acute events. So chronic events being those that gradually increase over time, such as rising sea levels and winter temperatures, and acute events being those that tend to be high impact, low frequency events, such as storms and heat waves. However, climate change risks, as we all know, are not discrete, and they will affect multiple sectors and assets at the same time. And many risks will also cascade through sectors. The climate system itself is highly complex, and when we start to consider the natural and built environments and infrastructure systems that climate change will interact with, this complexity is compounded, and of course the number of interdependencies also becomes very large. Now, there are different types of interdependencies, and Rich Dawson actually wrote a really good paper on this in 2015. But just to kind of summarize what those different types of interdependencies might be, they can be functional. So where you've got one system that relies upon another. So for example, a train station relying on power from a substation. They can be physical, so where systems interact through a physical process or shared attribute. So a good example being our freight and passenger travel on railways is limited by the capacity of the network. Geographic, so where geographic properties such as proximity, for example, lead to simultaneous responses in other systems. So for example, a bridge collapse may lead to ICT failure because the electricity cables are run over that bridge. They can be economic and or financial. So for example, where shared markets result in sectors interacting through the same economic systems, they create top-down economic interdependencies. Conversely, multiple sectors also converge at the same point of end users. So they might be individuals or buildings, whatever it might be, whose behaviour, such as the change in energy or demand or water use, is likely to be subject to budgetary constraints, therefore creating bottom-up economic interdependencies. And then lastly, policy and social. So individuals and organisations interact locally as well as at other geographic scales, for example, to help communicate risks and build their adaptive capacity. Now, crucially, these interdependencies are exacerbated by climate change. So this project, therefore, has the aim of better understanding the links and cascading effects between climate risks within those three sectors that I've described. And of course, a lot of work has been done in this space already, including the work by Rich Dawson and others that I mentioned earlier. Now, moreover, there are also a number of systems models that attempt to replicate system complexity and interdependencies, such as NISMOD, which many of you will have heard of, and also UK Times, but there are also plenty more as well. And in fact, as part of this work, we've looked at those models, of course. Therefore, our approach has learnt from those models and how they've mapped out those risks and understanding the complexity of the systems that they try to represent to help us understand the relationships and interactions that exist. So we've got a set of steering questions and therefore they focus on understanding what those priority interactions are, because of course if we understand where those interactions are, those priorities, we can focus our efforts. How these interactions affect the overall level of risk. Do they make it worse? Do they make it better? How those interactions differ by different locations, urban areas, coastal areas, etc., may have different impacts and different risk profiles, and whether any of those interactions result in any opportunities or indeed benefits. But also, we want to know how the strength of these interactions changes as a function of our greenhouse gas emissions, so aligning to 2-degree and 4-degree worlds as well. How that changes over different temporal scales, so looking at present day, 2050s and 2080s. How that changes across the UK and of course its devolved administrations as well, and also crucially in response to the adaptation actions that we are taking now and or have planned. So of course there's quite a lot to consider in this work, and I guess one of the challenges and one of the reasons why we've talked a lot, and Hugo mentioned this, why we've talked a lot about the work that's out there. There's a lot of people collecting data and developing these sorts of models, but few are actually trying to really map this out and gain an understanding of what this might look like and how it may affect risk. And that's what we're trying to tackle here. And you can appreciate there's some complexity here. And that's part of the reason actually why we've been restricted to the three sectors that I've described earlier. We're not looking at business and industry and international dimensions and those sorts of things as well. But of course, the work that we're doing will touch upon those just through its very nature. So our methodology, what are we doing? So I won't go through this in detail, but suffice to say, we've looked at what's out there already in stage 1. In stage 2, we've outlined what our model and our method looks like to capture some of that work, and equally where some of the gaps are. And now we're currently in stage 3, so we're looking at assessing and prioritizing those interactions, and the final part of stage 3 is developing and producing our model. Stage 4 is essentially applying the urgency framework that's been applied in the current CCRA and also CCRA 1, and that helps us to understand where we might need to prioritize action. And the lens that we're doing that through here, of course, is if those interactions affect the urgency of action that's required, then we'll need to help the various CCRA 3 chapter authors identify where those kind of strong and priority interactions are in order to modify those urgency scores. And then, of course, lastly, we've got a couple of outputs, so a technical report as is standard, and a number of communications products as well, including some infographics and online stuff as well. So I should actually say, just on the last slide, just to wrap that up, it's a 15-month project and it ends in January 2020 to align with the reporting and evidence in the next stage of the CCRA 3. So just a bit of background on CCRA 2. A narrative style was used to describe risk interactions. I won't do you the disservice of reading this out to you, but you can see that it was captured in a qualitative way, and that was great. It helped bring to life what some of those interactions may be, but it can be difficult to kind of take away from that what the priorities are and actually what the strength of course those interactions may be as well. I should also say, of course, that in the first CCRA in 2012, there were some systems maps that were generated, and they were quite useful. They went into quite a level of depth, but they were not always easy. It was not always easy to interpret and assess the magnitude of the impacts from the cascades that were identified, and therefore trying to understand what the actions that were needed to reduce these impacts was arguably a bit unclear. So our approach, of course, is to use systems maps as an effective way of summarizing the risk interactions, so visually for presentation and communication purposes, but then crucially in a quantitative sense, using a dependency modeling approach or Bayesian network modeling approach to turn these qualitative systems maps into semi-quantitative models. This technique captures the strength of the interactions and thus helps us to identify the most important interactions where policy intervention may be required. I've talked about systems maps a lot already. I'm going to show you a bit of an example later in terms of output, but just to kind of run you through what that kind of structure and those cascades might look like, I've just got 3 slides to run you through that. So here's an example. So in this case, only focusing upon the natural environment. We've got extreme summer temperatures here that affect the probability and or frequency of 3 hazardous events occurring. So heat waves, very hot days, so days above 30 degrees, and also wildfires. Note also that wildfire is affected by low summer rainfall as well. So in the next slide, you're kind of shifting to the right along that cascade. The heat wave hazard might contribute to numerous impacts, but 4 key examples in the natural environment are shown here. So lower air quality, animal and crop heat stress, high soil moisture deficit, and also high evapotranspiration. Shifting to the right once more, and you can see those kind of those nodes in the left-hand side grayed out from the previous slide. The animal and crop heat stress impact contributes to further impacts, including lower crop and forage yield and higher livestock mortality, which in turn, of course, result in lower livestock productivity. And this, of course, this is just one example within the natural environment sector, and I'm sure there are plenty more that you can think of, and indeed there are many more that we've mapped through this project, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour about how those cascades build up and interact. So some systems maps, and in terms of the outputs that we've developed so far. So this one looks a little bit more complicated, and it shows an interacting risks within the infrastructure sector based upon extreme rainfall. But you can also see with the red arrows and the red text, interactions across sector. So BE being the built environment, NE being the natural environment. And we've got, well, essentially, we've developed about 13 or so of these maps at this stage, and we've been through a process of refining these with a stakeholder group, and that stakeholder group comprises about 40 individuals representing a number of different organizations. And we are in the process at the moment of building what's called a kind of a mega map. So we've got these 13 individuals and we're stitching them all together. Now, if I were to show that to you on screen, it would just be a bunch of dots on a screen. So we haven't done that, but just to run you through what the systems map looks like for extreme rainfall and infrastructure. The other thing I should just caveat this map to say is that we had a stakeholder event and a workshop a few weeks ago. We've got a new version of this coming actually the end of this week, so it will be updated, but just bear with me on this. It's not changed very much. So extreme rainfall events contribute to 4 hazardous events that might be expected to occur with greater frequency due to climate change. But the map shows that for some of these events, other climate drivers also have an important interaction effect, including sea level rise and increased winter rainfall, leading to ground saturation. The primary impacts, so the grey circles, on the infrastructure sector are shown to the immediate right of the hazard nodes. The arrows connecting the hazardous events to the primary impacts are labelled with the corresponding risk descriptor codes from CCRA2. So many of you that are familiar with the UK climate change risk assessment, you'll know that there are a bunch of risks that have been used in that project, in that work, and they are represented through these different codes. So we can map those risks from the CCRA onto the risk pathways that we've identified. So these impacts result in direct costs, especially repair costs, but the right-hand side of the map also shows how the impacts cascade further within the infrastructure sector. For example, flooding of power infrastructure assets might result in power supply interruption, which may then result in disruption to water supplies, IT and communications, and also ongoing travel delays. This risk was recognised in CCRA2 with the IN1 or Infrastructure 1 risk descriptor. The interactions of climate drivers, hazards and impacts between sectors depends on the joins between one systems map and another, so the red text and arrows. For example, the flooding impacts shown on this map exclude any mention of flooding of properties because there is a separate map for the impact of extreme rainfall within the built environment. Our work at the moment, as I've mentioned, is focused upon identifying the interactions between these various maps, so looking at cross-sector interactions and finalising them before we can then build our quantitative model. The reason being that we don't want to be messing around with these maps and then building a model, because it takes a lot of time to build the model, and therefore we'll be spending a lot of budget and time messing around with it if we choose to change our minds. However, of course, in developing those maps, we'll also need to consider, and we're considering at the moment, how the different emission scenarios affect the impacts and indeed the cascades, how these impacts may be different, more or less severe in different parts of the UK. So, for example, heat impacts upon rail assets may be, and they are, quite different in the southeast than the northwest. How might these impacts change, become more or less severe over time as well, against the timescales that we've got for 2050 and 2080. So I mentioned that we're then transferring and translating these systems maps that are really useful for communication purposes and allowing organisations to engage in dialogue, both internally but also with external stakeholders as well, into quantitative models. This graphic shows the same model from the previous slide replicated in a piece of software called OpenMarkov. And this is an open source dependency or Bayesian network modeling software package, which we are using to model those interactions and impacts. The blue selector on the left shows the scenario in question and the time point, so 2050 and 2 degrees. The yellow nodes use probability tables to determine the likelihood of an event occurring within a year. And in this case, the annual probability of an extreme rainfall event, similar to that we experienced in the winter floods of 2015 and 16, is shown in this model. The green nodes are the endpoints of the pathways through the model. These are the impacts from the previous slide. And we can base these impacts on whatever we like. And in this particular case, we use the UK Environment Agency's report on economic costs associated to the 2015-16 floods. And in this model, the probability of each impact, the yellow nodes occurring, is shown by the red bars. In this particular case, 2050 in our 2 degree scenario, the annual likelihood of an extreme rainfall event being present is only 5%. So most of the other nodes also show a low probability of an event occurring and or an impact being medium or high, taking into account the interaction from all of the other nodes and those pathways. Crucially then, the green nodes therefore show the expected value in millions of pounds for the risk associated from each pathway, where the risk is calculated based upon the probability of the event occurring and the scale of the impact. To give you an example of the output, this table that I've just shown on screen now represents the current and future level of risk, taking into account the interactions within the infrastructure sector. Once the different systems maps are joined together and we've built the model, this summary table will also show the effect of interactions between the sectors as well. And this is one of the benefits of dependency modeling, because it also allows us to show and identify the main contributions to the overall risk by looking at the importance of each node individually, so we can get the model to spit out and tell us which nodes have the most impact upon the outputs, which allow us to identify where the priority interactions are, which is one of the aims of the project, of course, but it also allows us to understand through a combination of the size or the magnitude of the impact and or the connectiveness of the node, how important that node may be as well, and therefore where we may want to prioritize action. So that's just a bit of a quick overview of the project. You understand that we've been doing this since about November, December last year, and as I mentioned, we're just in the point of finalising those maps. We've got a stakeholder event actually next week to finalise those and get them signed off. And in the background, we're building the model. So the focus for next steps is to, of course, get those maps complete and signed off such that they won't change. Caveating that to say, of course, that we can model these interactions to the nth degree. We can go into, you know, a really quite high level of granularity, but that's complex, and it's not the aim of this work to do that. What we're trying to understand is what those interactions are and how that affects risk overall. Now, one of the strengths, of course, of the modelling approach is that we can just add more maps in if we want to. We can add more impact nodes. We can look at different hazards. So we can scale up the process and the methodology as we see fit. So the next stage, of course, then is to collate some quantitative evidence, and I mentioned the Environment Agency report that we use in the example I just provided, but we also need other impact information as well. And of course, in some areas and some sectors, we've got more of an idea about what some of that impact data might look than others. So we've got a more certainty around impacts of flooding on infrastructure than we do on lightning in the built environment, for example. And we'll need to come up with that information and or come up with some assumptions and validate that through the stakeholder group that we've got. We've got an ongoing process of stakeholder engagement to help validate the systems maps that we've got, and also the model inputs and also the outputs to make sure that they're sensible. And then we've got the usual kind of reporting that'll be kind of spat out at the end of this, as well as an online tool which we're developing that will allow members of the public on our WSP website and hopefully on the CCC website to have a go at playing through some of these different risk interactions. So, for example, if you're interested in the infrastructure sector, you can kind of hover over and show all of the different risk cascades relating to infrastructure and going into other sectors. Equally, if you're just interested in rainfall, you can do the same and turn things on and off. So we're developing that now, and that'll be an output. And then, as I mentioned, lastly, the project's going to be completed in January 2020. So I think that's it from me. I think I understand that we're doing questions at the end. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul, for a whistle-stop tour of a very big and very interesting project. Keep the questions coming in if you do want to ask some questions, which, as Paul has just said, will be taken right at the very end of this webinar. Moving on now then to the presentation from BGS, which will cover the report I mentioned earlier. And we have two speakers from BGS, Roxana Kiriun and Joel Gill. So we can now see your screen. If you unmute yourself, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Owen. Good morning, everybody. My name is Roxana Kiriun, and together with Joel Gill, we have the pleasure to present you a review of environmental multi-hazards research and risk assessment, a study that we performed together with the National Hazard Partnership partners. And before going into the presentation, I would like to give you a bit of the content of the following minutes. Shortly, I'm going to go through the project background, what were the research aim and objectives, followed by an introduction of the main findings of the multi-hazards review in the academic literature provided by Joel. I will move forward then to review the literature that reflects the multi-hazard research and practice in policy and industry. And finally, I will mention some key findings and gaps and recommendations. As I mentioned before, the project looks into the review of environmental multi-hazards, and it has been commissioned by NERC partners in response to the growing recognition of the needs to assess risk associated with multi-hazard events as opposed to hazards occurring in isolation. And as you can see here, the partners that actually work together with us to perform this research come from NHP Framework Partnership, Public Health England, Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and Health and Safety Executive. Now, we performed our research based on two main approaches. The first one was to look into a number of papers, both grey as well as peer-reviewed literature. And the second approach was a stakeholder survey, which I will explain more in detail later. Now, what is the challenge of multi-hazards? Before describing a bit or the background and the technology of multi-hazards concept, I will briefly introduce the objectives of our work. We aimed at identifying what research and capability exists in academia and practice, both industry and policy, in order to understand the processes underlying multi-hazards events and especially their socioeconomic impacts and associated risks. We strive to gather evidence on the scale of socioeconomic impacts of multi-hazard events. We try to understand how industry and policymakers currently consider within their approaches multi-hazard risk assessments and what are their future ambitions with regards to that. And lastly, identify what existing or new knowledge is required to advance our understanding of multi-hazard processes and their impacts, as well as what methods and approaches are available currently in policy and or practice. Multi-hazards have been targeted as an area of exploration not only internationally but also nationally. Historically, we know that most risk analysis in disaster risk research was undertaken and assessed on hazard by hazard basis. However, we've seen, especially in the last few decades, that interactions between environmental hazards, what we call multi-hazards, can generate impacts that are different or greater than those caused by individual hazards in isolation. Within this study, we use a multi-hazard definition stated by UNISDR, by which multi-hazards are either a selection of multiple major hazards that a country faces, or more specifically, the context where hazardous events may occur simultaneously, cascadingly, or cumulatively over time. And possibly one of the most important components of this definition, the fact that we need to take into account the potential for interrelated effects, as it has been clearly explained by my previous speakers. Now, within our research, we used a classification that looks at three types of hazard relationships. The first one is a triggering relationship, which can be defined as one hazard triggering another hazard, or a series of triggering relationships forming a cascade or domino effect. If you take this relationship, we can give an example. As you can see in the left-hand side figure, cascading hazards from tsunami, earthquake, tsunami, and then impact of floods. A second type of relationship is the amplification one, where one hazard changes the probability or increases the probability of a subsequent hazard. And here we can imagine an example where, for example, for an earthquake, increases the probability of landslide occurrence in an area. And lastly, compound hazards that may, on one hand, coincide in space and time, and potentially result in impacts that are greater than the sum of the two, or they can occur consecutively, with one hazard changing the vulnerability of exposed assets so as to make them more susceptible to the effect of the following hazards.
Brilliant. Good morning. My name is Joel Gill. I'm was the work package lead for the academic component of this review, and want to just give a little overview as to some of our key findings from looking at the academic literature. So the aim of this particular work package was to identify and summarize general multi-hazard tools and techniques that is described in the academic literature. So not necessarily, I'm not looking at what hazard pairings or are particularly relevant to any given sector or any given context, but looking at a range of tools that have been developed and are used and applied in academia that could be taken into different contexts. So we did this through a literature review, looking at both peer review and grey literature, recognising that lots of what's published and is labelled multi-hazard doesn't necessarily comply with the definition that we were using adapted from the UNISDR, and also that this is a developing field of work, that this is something where there is a push in terms of research investments, that it's an area where there is a growing interest in the academic community, and therefore it's also rapidly developing with new papers such as the one that Hugo mentioned published recently, which is an excellent resource to both the academic and the non-academic community. What we found was that there's a range of literature out there that helps to either characterize a hazard landscape, so particularly looking at assessing hazard or components of hazard, but also literature that looks at damage to assets, so starts to move from multi-hazard into multi-hazard risk, with a range of both qualitative and quantitative approaches, both having particular uses and importance depending on the contexts. And also lots of examples of studies that focus on one factor that might be required to support a full multi-hazard approach, and other examples that collate multiple tools, some from existing sources, to present a more complete multi-hazard approach. So it could be that there's a need for multiple steps in order to understand and act on a multi-hazard landscape, which requires multiple different tools or models to be brought together. In the report, and this is in section 2.1.1.2, we describe a number of different approaches and characterize these in going from qualitative through to quantitative. The report discusses some of the benefits to, or the applications of these different approaches, recognizing again that context matters, that data availability is different from place to place and matters. So the matrix approach, for example, built in on what Hugo said earlier about it being a very useful screening process, is also something that can be used to identify and discuss potential scenarios with a range of different decision makers and stakeholders to help understand their priorities, and that's something that has been developed and used in a more mature way. Moving to some of the more probabilistic and statistical approaches, an example of where they are relatively more developed is in looking at something such as the built infrastructure, bridges, for example, and thinking about the design criteria that's necessary in order to develop the bridge with a certain resilience to something such as flooding and earthquakes, and what would happen if they were to occur either in a compound way, so overlapping in space and time, or consecutively. Some of the observations and emerging themes are, first of all, there's a relatively limited number of papers that move beyond looking at a hazard pairing or a very specific context into approaches that support the development of multi-hazard approaches in a wider set of contexts. What is there often looks at critical infrastructure, so that's an area where I think there is a maturity and lessons can be taken from the civil and structural engineering communities. Lots of the literature focuses on simulations rather than actual events in regions, and the complexity of the real natural environment where there are often more than two hazards at play. There could be a whole range of hazards that could occur, that could overlap in space and time, and that's something that needs to be moved forward in terms of our understanding of how to deal with that. The integration of multiple methods is something that I indicated earlier, that there are papers that are bringing together different tools, and I think that's something that's likely to be necessary, drawing on a range of different disciplines as well. And also that the application will guide the most appropriate methods. So quantitative approaches aren't always needed, and I think what we set out in our report is a spectrum of methods, that we can't necessarily say this is better than another one. It depends on the context, and there are contexts in which all of those could be applied with useful effect. And I'll hand back to Roxana now.
Thank you, Joel. During our work, HSE has looked into the societal and economic consequences of multi-hazard. So Sarah Grady and Tim Aldridge made a review of grey and peer review literature that identifies what are the impacts of multi-hazards using an economic framework, so a methodology that is based on looking at different indicators and impact groups. One of their main findings was that there was no universally accepted methodology of how to assess the impacts of multi-hazards. Therefore, there is a clear need for further research. Some other key observations were that none of the case studies they analyzed could be found that quantified the total impact in terms of its constituents. And by that I mean the fact that it was difficult to demonstrate that multi-hazards result in impacts greater than the sum of their components. So there is a clear gap there in the literature whereby researchers are able to demonstrate that multi-hazards have a greater impact than hazards in isolation. Another key finding was that it was difficult to prove that one hazard can change the vulnerability and thereby increase the risk of subsequent hazards. And finally, there is a significant data gap that is able to support a full economic costing assessment, which should include as well effects on population and work. Moving on to the evidence found in the literature regarding multi-hazards in industry and policy. The grey literature on multi-hazards indicates that most of the approaches look into exposure and resilience of different receptors, such as roads infrastructure, so transport infrastructure, energy, assets, in order to accommodate threats from multiple hazards. But also it looks at potential impacts and risk to multiple interacting hazards. Our review showed that there is an increased level of maturity in terms of literature findings from recognizing complexity and interaction between hazards, which is a case in most policy documents, to endorsing and recommending different methods, and finally describing, illustrating different qualitative and quantitative methods, which is mostly the realm of industry literature or industry-related literature. There are synergies between practice and academic literature, and as it can be observed on the right-hand side graph, most of the qualitative and semi-quantitative methods range between hazard matrices, network diagrams, hazard maps, and hazard and risk indices. However, hazard matrices are most used in non-academic literature. And with regards to quantitative models or methods, probabilistic and statistical methods are most frequently employed. Key findings are to some degree very similar to what the academic literature showed. First and foremost, there is a limited amount of information and documentation, therefore we need to improve the evidence-based research. There's a limited use of multi-hazard approaches and risk assessment tools in practice, but there is as well an increase in interest in providing that to policy and industry representatives. The range of qualitative and semi-quantitative methods identified in the academic literature is greater than those that were identified in the industry and literature. Quantitative methods applied in industry are as complex as diverse as those described in the academia. And finally, the energy sector is leading in the use of multi-hazard approaches. And we've heard very good examples from Hugo earlier on where the research is going in terms of the most up-to-date methods and innovative tools. The second methodology that we employed for our study was to use a stakeholder survey by which 33 representatives from 25 organizations answered a set of questions, the majority of which were actually from the industry. 27% were policy representatives and 21% were academics. The range of questions that we were interested in related with policy and industry stakeholders' level of knowledge. So we were interested to know how many, what is their take on and knowledge on approaches and methods used in both research and practice. And as you can see in this table, policy representatives have a fair to up to none knowledge about research methods and tools and approaches, but they have a better understanding and knowledge of methods and methods and tools used in practice. While the industry representatives seem to have a more balanced level of knowledge with regards to both research and practice. We also wanted to understand what is the take of different stakeholders in policy and industry with regards to advantages and disadvantages of current multi-hazard risk assessments. And to give you an example, it was clear that in terms of disadvantages, there is insufficient data and knowledge to work with for low probability events. And unfortunately, they also identified that current approaches are unable to distinguish between combined hazards and combined impacts. But the advantages of employing multi-hazard risk assessment methodologies were also indicated. For example, it was clear that such approaches can reduce uncertainties and improve decision-making, as well as being able to identify and screen possible combination of hazards which can possibly reduce future risk. Another topic of interest was for us to identify which multi-hazard scenarios are most relevant or of concern for policy and industry. And the respondents identified quite a number of multi-hazard scenarios, but I will list only the three most frequently named. Storm surges and flooding, river and coastal flooding, and finally strong winds, snow, ice, and extreme cold. We also looked into what are the barriers and enablers of uptaking multi-hazard approaches in their day-to-day work. And during the stakeholder survey, these barriers and enablers were identified, and we tried to collect them to group them into a few categories. Collaboration and knowledge transfer was one of the problems that was often identified. It seems that hazard experts are often siloed within organizations, and there is clearly a greater need of dialogue between those involved in fundamental science and those concerned with assessing impact, particularly the less measurable ones. Another barrier is the fact that we don't have enough evidence-based research knowledge. So that indicates that it's difficult to for industry stakeholders, for example, to provide a solid needs case for investing in multi-hazard research and development. Data and uncertainties are clearly another barrier that inherently links the models that we actually used in research to what potential risk outputs can be used in practice, and especially how these models can be used to assess and characterize vulnerability, exposure, and hazard cascades. And finally, the lack of resources and guidance was another barrier which the participants noted. In terms of the practitioner's view on the lack of knowledge or skills, these were the stakeholders also identified a number of reasons why the lack of knowledge and skills is still a problem. And their take on this was very much related with the barriers and enablers of multi-hazard approaches. So collaboration and knowledge transfer was a problem, process understanding, the current data methods and models, receptor and impact information, and finally the existing resources and skills. So as key observation and emerging themes, there are obviously a number of opportunities that we can try to take in terms of identifying the barriers. So if we increase the institutional and sectorial dialogue between partners, we can reduce the lack of knowledge and improve the knowledge transfer. The increased number of systematic reviews and evidence-based research can reduce the lack of knowledge in this area. Methods and models to characterize exposure, vulnerability, and hazard cascades. And finally, another enabler of multi-hazard research uptake, access to data and resources. What are the key findings of our work? I'm just going to summarize a few of the gaps and recommendations. Clearly, one of the gaps identified within our work was an understanding of multi-hazard processes, testing of multi-hazard assessment methodologies in different socio-economic contexts, understanding of multi-hazards in terms of the conceptual framework that we can develop around in research, limited understanding of UK multi-hazards. So more case studies based in the UK are clearly identified as a potential enabler and as a gap. Accounting for differences between single and multi-hazards. So clearly coming back to the problem of understanding what are the impacts and effects of single versus multiple hazards. Creeping changes in vulnerability associated with multi-hazards, which obviously will have an impact on changes in risk to multi-hazards. The lack of data for understanding costs. The lack of in-depth case studies. Better links between science, industry, and policy, and with an improved baseline of knowledge for multi-hazards, knowledge transfer and communication, and finally the lack of regulatory and legislative framework. The recommendations listed here are described in more detail in our report, as well as presented briefly in the summary Syria has presented, and it is available on the website. I'm just going to briefly mention here one of the main opportunities that we can take in terms of knowledge transfer and a better exchange between different communities is to organize obviously workshops to share good practices identified in this review and other studies and projects. Building a multi-hazard community that brings together different sectors or representatives from different areas. Some general guidance on what multi-hazard scenarios could affect UK. A guidance on multi-hazard methodologies and approaches used, and especially how to assess them in terms of their quality and appropriateness for different contexts. Case studies based on actual events, where interdependencies between different receptors are taken into account. So we're talking here obviously about cascading hazards, but also about the interlinkages between different asset networks within a systems approach, and especially trying to find or enhance different funding calls, a special issue possibly for peer review publication, and ways forward to encourage publishing and capture of multi-hazard approaches and applications. And I will end my presentation with a big thank you for all contributors to this work, especially the stakeholders, survey participants from different sectors. Without your contribution, this work wouldn't have been possible, and I will give the floor to Owen.
Thank you very much indeed, Roxana and Joel. And we'll have seen from the first three presentations there are some commonalities between them and some common themes emerging. Before we go on to the final three presentations, which are all NERC ERIP projects, we wanted to spend a few minutes undertaking a short poll. We'll present a number of questions to you, and we ask that if you can have a quick look at them and respond as quickly as you can. They are, it'll be an anonymous poll, so if you're unsure, just press don't know, and we'll try and see how many we can get through in the time allocated. As I said, it's just to get a sort of a quick snapshot of your views of what you've heard so far and some of the issues. The reason that that slide was shown is that the first question was really about whether you agree or recognize the three types of hazards, i.e. triggering, amplification, and compounds and coincidence. So we leave about 30 seconds for you to click on one of those boxes and see where this goes. Okay, 75% of people voted, thank you. The answers are, to the questions, are 67% yes, 1% no, 18% partly, and 14% don't know. And we'll circulate a summary of this after the event. So now on to the next question, Jack. Have you attempted or undertaken an analysis of multi-hazards in relation to specific assets or groups of assets? Okay, 85% of you voted on that, thank you. And the answer to the question was 31% responded yes, and 69% responded no. So on to the next question. Do you feel that analytical techniques and data exist for considering environmental multi-hazards? Okay, so 85% voted on that one, and the responses there were 27% yes for very few impact combinations, 27% yes including some common combinations, 5% yes for majority of the common combinations, 13% no, and 28% don't know. So again, thank you for that. Okay, the next question, I guess, is mainly for those with research backgrounds, and for researchers and those who are involved in modelling and statistics. Do you feel that techniques and data exist? If not, where are the gaps? So 52% voted there, 33% said both techniques and data, 16% said mainly data, 15% said mainly techniques, and 36% said don't know. As I said, we'll circulate a summary of these afterwards. So the next question, please. In terms of moving forward and moving practice forward, should the focus of effort be on which of the following, in your view? Okay, 73% of you voted on this one, and the results are 57% felt communication knowledge sharing was something that was needed, 28% for the development of analytical techniques, 42% gathering of case studies, 54% gathering of data evidence, and 10% voted don't know. So thank you. Next question. I mentioned at the start that we were considering, as part of the ERIP program, running a face-to-face workshop exploring some of the topics on this. Can you indicate whether that's something you'd be interested in taking part in? Okay, 70% of you voted for that one. 1% said yes to share experience, 47% yes to learn, 31% said yes to both of those. So that's quite a good almost 75–80%, and 20% indicated no. So thank you for that quick poll, and thank you for bearing with us with the speed of this. So we will now revert back to the programme and go back to the final three speakers. And the first one is a dual presentation involving Mariam Imani from Anglia Ruskin University and Donia Hajalizadeh from the University of Surrey. So Donia and Mariam, we're now handing over control of the screen to you. Make sure that you're unmuted, and over to you.
Sure. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen and we can hear you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mariam from Anglia Ruskin University. I'm a senior lecturer in civil engineering with expertise in water and wastewater infrastructure resilience and optimization. The title of the project is an industry-friendly resilience-based interdependency assessment tool for the case study of North Argyll in Scotland. The duration of this project was 6 months from November 2017 to April 2018, and the partners of the project were Transport Scotland, Scottish Water, SSE, and Atkins. As Owen mentioned, this was part of the ERI program funded by NERC, and the focus of the project, the focus area, were mainly around failure propagation in infrastructure networks and the impacts of cascading failures due to these interdependencies between different types of infrastructure networks. And the ambition of the project was basically, obviously, to understand how integrated infrastructure design can deliver local and regional economic resilience and recovery in response to environmental crisis, extreme weather conditions, creating a dynamic decision-making for, again, infrastructure networks to extreme events, and also creating a consistent narrative to be played through business scenario planning, again, in the context of infrastructure networks, and finally, managing these future uncertainties in long-term infrastructure investments. One of the key challenges our project partners and industry they were facing was around the prioritization of their interventions for investment on their interdependent assets. In other words, they wanted to know how exactly they can improve the intervention strategies in their day-to-day business in response to extreme conditions for their interdependent assets, how they needed evidence, quantified, measured, and mapped evidences to make business cases for investment on intervention for their interdependent assets, basically. Well, obviously, the speakers in the panel, they talked today a lot about, obviously, different types of extreme environmental challenges. And we hear about them all around the world, and that they hit infrastructure networks, and due to the cascading failures, the society, environment, and economy will be affected. So pretty much in this project, we are looking into the same thing. So the aim of this project is to develop a decision support system to model infrastructure interdependencies of three critical infrastructure networks of water, transport, and energy that we have focused on them in this project. And we provide a measure of network resilience in response to hazardous events, in addition to measure of vulnerability that has been conventionally around. So one of the speakers, I think it was Paul, mentioned about a more quantitative approaches. So this study has taken a very quantitative approach to model and measure the extent of damages and measuring the system performance in terms of its resiliency to the interdependent assets failures. So, and that can facilitate, we believe that can facilitate decision-making process, as I mentioned earlier. So the case study we considered in this project is the North Argyll in Scotland. This case study has three parts of the land part of that is in the mainland and includes 2 islands as well, and has had a history and a record of being affected, hit by extreme environmental hazardous condition, and a very good example of an isolated community when it comes to extreme weather conditions and the interdependent assets that they fail, that they affect this community. So this community has had a history on these conditions, and basically this is case study again is one of the third sparses population of the 32 Scottish local authorities. So to great extent was a very good example case study that we could look at interdependency induced failures in the networks that they serve in this community. And then there has been a record of, for example, a 5-night blackout due to a very snow hit that has affected this community, and as a result of that, completely could meet the requirements of what we were planning to deliver in this project. So this project is taking the all hazards approach and looking at network failure states. Previous speakers, they talked about multi-hazards, combination of them. They can be stochastic, and considering the uncertainties, their combination, and you can imagine how complex it can be when it comes to infrastructure interdependencies, that you want to study different failure scenarios that can happen due to these multi-hazards, and it can become very complex. Even modeling the network interdependence by itself is a very complex task. And if you put it in the context of or interaction with multi-hazard, you can imagine how challenging it can become. So in order to deliver in 6 months what we promised, we have taken an all hazards approach. And in this all hazards approach, we are focusing on the system. So the focus would be at the system level. Basically, in this all hazards approach, we look at the system through the failure process. And the way that we define it, we say anything that can happen to an asset in a network, no matter, regardless of what the reason, what the hazard or the event or triggering factor has been, we take it from the moment that failure happens. It can be a partial failure to that asset, it can be a full failure of that asset. And when the failure happens, what are the impacts? And again, you can have different performance measure you can define for your network in order to measure the impact on the system. So here is the process. There is an event, then there is a failure mechanism that could be a very, very short process mechanism. It could be long, it can happen through time. And then the system gonna experience a failure state. And to a very great extent, this approach can simplify from a very, very complex multidimensional event process. It can be shorted, it can be limited to a number of failure states at a system level that you can recognize and you can count them. So a very good example of that, it was when a recent bridge collapse, and all of us remember in Italy, Randi Bridge is a very good example of that, after a lot of reviews, expert reviews that have been done, various factors like heavy winds, poor or inadequate monitoring maintenance process, maybe economic crisis, heavy traffic design flows, and all of that I can categorize them as different sort of different points of this failure mechanism. They all came together and you could see that bridge collapse that happened. So if you want to study this bridge as an asset in transport network, for example, we can say a complete closure of this bridge, a collapse of this bridge is a failure state. In this project, we consider it from the moment that this failure has happened, and we apply this approach throughout the project and the modeling of the network. And the impact, again, is defined at the system level. For example, we can measure the impact in terms of number of users that are in service or are out of service, or the flooding, for example, in different contexts might happen somewhere, or in terms of water contamination or road closure. So as you can see, in terms of number of assets, but this impact can have consequences, and even you can go to a wider context like social consequences, environmental consequences, economic consequences, and so on and so forth. In this project, we focus at the system level, and we focus on the failure states and impact in terms of the number of users are in service. So the framework we have in the case study area, we had water, energy, and transport. Our transport system in this particular case study had 3 modes of road, rail, and ferry networks. So we modeled the system and as different layers that mapped and modeled a dependency in each network, and also interdependency, means connection with different with the other networks in terms of their interactions. When we modeled all these assets, obviously, and then we were able to fail any asset that a user wants. The tool was able, you could fail it, and you could see the failure propagation. On the right hand side, you can see all those dots and lines in red shows the failure propagation across the whole network through the interdependent assets, and you could see which part of the network and which networks, what assets, which part of the interdependent network has been affected by that. And then based on that, obviously we could measure the performance of the system in terms of resilience. And the speakers here talked about resilience, and obviously you're familiar with this conventional common curve for resilience that is used, that you obviously define a performance function for your system. For our case was the number of users in the service, and the resilience obviously is defined as a whole. So in addition to measure of vulnerability in the system, as a whole, you can measure the resilience of the system. And in this project, in addition to measure of resilience, we have measured the monetary costs of resilience when it comes to intervention of the failed assets. And then the system will report back to the system, and we could see again, when you intervene and you fix an asset or you replace a failed asset, what happens to the network, and how quickly network can bounce back to the normal operation. Again, in this framework, back to the theories of resilience. I don't want to go into nitty-gritty of this, but in the resilience curve, obviously, you can define it in different. You can characterize the resilience network. Resilience curve. In this project, obviously, we defined different zones for resilience, and a holistic resilience-based approach kind of carries certain characteristics in each zone. Before the event, for example, in zone 1, which basically goes around the idea of failure mechanisms. This is something that before, when an actual failure happens, you need to study the system, that how it's performing, and it can be a multidimensional problem, something that I think that didn't happen or came together, and as a result of and triggered that failure in that for that bridge in Italy. In zone 2, which obviously how quickly system can get failed, the gradient of this line, how long will it take, and that goes back again to vulnerability, and what we define it as a robustness of the system. In zone 3, the duration that the system can stay in this minimum failure and minimum performance level, and in zone 4, how quickly it can bounce back to normal operation. In zone 5 is a normal functionality of the system. So 5 different zones that we have considered the same principles in this project in terms of quantifying resilience. I'll quickly skip this slide, and I'll go back to that later. As you can see here, this is the case study area, and as I explained, we have 3 types of infrastructure and 3 modes of transport network, specifically North Argyll, as you can see, and with 2 islands, as you can see here, and obviously, we modeled that as nodes and links. Paul mentioned that you might deal with a bunch of dots, bunch of dots clumped, and you can see that like this, but you can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can have a clear vision of that. Each color represents a network. The blue color obviously shows the for example, the ferry network. The purple color shows the transport network, yellow shows the energy network, and the light blue color shows the water network. And as you can see here, each node or each link represents an asset in the network, and user can define it. For example, a node in energy network can represent a power station, or a link in transport network can represent a bridge, for example, or a node in water systems can represents a pumping station. And obviously, if I go back to this slide. This is a very this is a very fast lapse of the web tool we developed. It comes in three different tabs. The first tab basically focuses on the failure propagation in the network. As you can see, it's been modeled here. The second tab focuses on the interdependency assessment of the network, that the user has the option to fail the interdependent assets and fail them and measure the system resilience of the system due to that failure, and then can introduce intervention in the third tab. As you can see here, can introduce the cost for that and see the impact of that intervention into the system. In the first tab, the failure propagation, user can fail on any asset that it wants, partially or fully. You can have a single failure in the system, you can have concurrent failure in the system, and you can all the time you can monitor resilience variation and the cost of that in the system. Sorry, we had just 15 minutes. I tried to be quick. So and that's the web tool that's been developed, and the resilience level in the system has been color coded in terms of high resilience, medium level of resilience, and low level of resilience, traffic color coded, and basically in the graphs that can be provided it's observable. The last tab is a report lab that user can customize. Each interdependent each network can provide can customize a report that they want in terms of the interdependent asset failure, the interventions that they've been introduced, and to what extent resilience has been improved in the system. So I hand over from here to my colleague Jonia. She will take you through some of the other results we found in this project. Thank you.
Okay, so we're now handing over.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you, and thank you, Mariam, and hello all. So what I will do, I will just walk you through some of the assessments we've done with this tool and its implication in practice, really. Just to put the examples into context, I will give you an overview of the case study. The case study is kind of a notional case study, and the reason for that is the challenges with the data that has been already mentioned in the other presentations. Now, when I say the challenges with the data, I'm referring to the problems with sharing the data that's not only sensitive from commercial sense, but also from security point of view. So we won't be able to actually see where the actual location of the main or critical assets in the energy or water network is. And what we've done in this project is to use whatever is available as an open source data and have our industry partners help in providing a notional network that is a good representative of the actual infrastructure network in the case study area. Given the nature of the transport network, in particular in the road network, you would expect to see the majority of the assets in the road network being the junctions and the links that you have. And if you have the bidirectional roads, you would consider two links between each junction, so which is kind of explaining why we have the majority of the nodes or assets in the road network. Also, we have the distribution of the links between the assets. Again, the majority is for the road network, but also because of the nature of the notional example, we had the option of playing around with some of these connections. So what we wanted to do is to study what is the impact of interdependency level in infrastructure resilience. So what we've done, we've introduced different levels of interdependency. What that means is we've played around with the connections that exist between different systems. So for instance, we've assumed a high level of interdependency for water network, where we assumed all assets in the water distribution network, and when we are talking about water distribution, we are referring to drinking water distribution network. And we've assumed all the assets in this network is dependent on energy assets that we have in the notional network. For the ferry network, we've considered a different level of interdependency, where all the assets in the rail network is dependent on energy, and some level of dependency to the water network, and there's some connections to the road assets, which kind of a bidirectional links. What we've done with this is just to understand what is the impact of infrastructure interdependency and individual infrastructure resilience. Now, for the very first experiments that we've done, as Mariam mentioned, the failure scenarios that we've introduced is regardless of what is the source of failure. So when we're talking about failure, we're assuming that the performance of the asset has been disrupted for whatever reason, and we're taking the behavior of the system from that point on. So for the first experiments, we've looked at all the possible failure scenarios that you could possibly have in a system. So, and we've looked at the impact of these failure scenarios in an alluvial diagram that you're seeing on my screen here. And the impact is studied on the performance of each system, and the performance of each system can be reported in different indicators, but what we've used in this study is a number of users that have been have lost their service due to that disruption. What I have on the left-hand side is, in a sense, all the possible assets that you could have in each system, and different colors actually represents different systems. The impact of the failure of that individual asset on the entire network is represented by the weight or the thickness of that strand, and the end point is representing the impact on each individual system, which is why you have 5 systems on the right-hand side. What we can see in this diagram is obviously as you increase the interdependency level, as is the case for the rail network and the water network, the difference in the color changes, which means you have scenarios, failure scenarios that wouldn't be necessarily in your own network, but it has been caused or initiated by the interdependency provider network. And as you increase these, you would increase the failure scenarios that the system is vulnerable to. You would have a system which is independent, such as the energy network, and you would only see one color in that energy network as is seen on the right-hand side we've got here. Now, what this highlights is, generally speaking, we are very much aware of the failure scenarios that our own assets are prone to. But when it comes to interdependency-induced scenarios, these are the hidden vulnerabilities that not generally are considered in looking at maintenance and mitigation strategies. And what this does is actually highlighting the importance of considering the multi-hazards due to interdependency-induced failures. Now, in the next example, what we've got is to look into the importance of consideration of resilience as a complementary factor to vulnerability. What we've got on the left-hand side is a map of the case study. Again, we're looking at all the single failure scenarios. So the initiating failure is shown by the red dot here, and the propagated failure is highlighted by the yellow color on this map. It just shows the spatial distribution of that failure in that particular asset. What I have on the right-hand side is all these 3 color grids. And on the y-axis, you've got the resilience, and the y-axis is the vulnerability. We've calculated the resilience and vulnerability for every single failure scenario, and we've just filtered the interdependency-induced failure scenarios. Obviously, you would expect for the independent networks, you wouldn't see much variation in your failure scenarios purely because they're not dependent on other networks. Now, for interdependent networks, such as the water network and rail network, you kind of see this scattered variation in your resilience versus failure scenario for every single failure scenario, as shown by the grey dots, which kind of highlights that the relationship between the resilience and vulnerability is not linear, in particular when it comes to interdependent networks. As you increase the number of scenarios, so if you go from single scenario to double failure scenarios, you would actually see this behavior more pronounced, which is a more of a case for particularly worst case scenarios where you would have not only one failure scenario, but multiple failure scenarios or concurrent failure scenarios. So I will skip these. These are just showing different failure scenarios that are given the time remaining. Now, you can also use this spatial distribution in highlighting your high risk zone, which means, which kind of supports you in identifying the best locations or optimized locations for depots or redundancy measures that you could possibly introduce into system. I will skip this. And the main kind of outcome from these analyses is to introduce a concept called shared interventions, where you would be able to start the negotiations where the interdependent network can take care of the mitigation and maintenance measures for the service that is being received. So what I mean by that, when you have all the assets in the energy network, for example, here plotted and ranked based on their importance for the energy network, and do the same for the interdependent network, in this example, the rail network, you could actually highlight the assets that are of particular importance for the interdependent network. Now, what happens is you could identify the assets that perhaps not of particular importance for your own system, but it's of particular importance for the receiving system. And then you would be able to start the negotiation around the possibility of handing over the interventions or mitigation to the receiving service system and kind of speed up the recovery and hence the resilience of the receiving system accordingly. This is of particular importance when it comes to an asset or system that is receiving system from receiving service from multiple systems. And you could actually see even 1 hour change in the resilience in all the providing sources could actually have a huge impact on the rail network that I have in this example. I'm sorry that I've rushed through some of these slides, it's just we're kind of running over time now. The next step that we have for this project has finished last year. So the next step is really looking at the possibilities of expanding our resilience measure into resilience indicators in particular, to be able to highlight and kind of cross-link the mitigation measures properly to address different resilience qualities actually. I just wanted to finally take this opportunity to thank our industry partners. Given all the challenges with the data, we couldn't finish this project if it wasn't for them, for their help in kind of closing the gap in the data. And I apologize again that we've run over time now, but I hand over to Owen again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donia and Mariam. Moving swiftly on, the next presentation is from Tom Coulthard. Tom, if you can make sure that you've unmuted yourself and I think we can see your screen. Over to you. I can hear you as well. So over to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone for sticking around and listening. So this is a description of, or a presentation about a ERIC project we had funded that actually finished at the beginning of 2019, but is carrying on. The PDRA, Lisa Harrison, who's done all the work, is carrying on with this work through some extra funding we've managed to secure. So we are particularly interested in using process-based hydrodynamic models to look at combination hazards in estuary systems. So what happened if you had extreme rainfall, storms and high tides all sort of occurring at the same time. And our methods or our background for doing this was really that sort of existing methods for assessing combination hazards are typically, though not exclusively, based on probabilities, which are good for certain things, certainly have a very wide reach and can look at, say, maximum water levels, but not, for example, giving good information on the location of the maximum water levels, and don't necessarily consider the physics of each driver in combination when it comes to estuary water bodies. And so in a combination hazard in an estuary, you're really just squishing the same glob of water around in different ways through these different drivers. And in turn, this can come to difficulties in representing what happens with changes in these drivers due to climate change. So we used a simple and fast 2D hydrodynamic model based on the LISFLOOD FP formulation developed in Bristol to simulate coast, estuary and fluvial systems all in one network. The model is free, you can download it, there's a link at the bottom of the page here. So we had some key questions with this. about the impacts of combination hazards in estuary environments. And to answer these questions really focused around a sort of a sensitivity analysis, I guess. So our questions were, how does the timing of the hazards affect flood risk? How might climate change influence this? For example, sea level rise, greater fluvial discharges, and in turn, which drivers transpire to be most significant? And we chose to look at this in two very different estuaries. So we looked at the Dyfi estuary in West Wales, which has a catchment area above it of about 500 square kilometres, and in contrast, a very large estuary on the east of the UK, the Humber, with roughly 25,000 kilometres squared, so draining about a third of England. And we tested these different drivers predominantly by using what we call worst case scenarios, so using the worst case surge recorded, the worst case tide or the highest tide recorded, the worst case fluvial events, the worst case surge tides, and threw together lots of different combinations of these and looked at the impacts. So our first question is, how does the timing of different events impact flood risk? For example, how does the timing of flood peak related to a storm surge peak change inundation patterns? And a sub-question of that is, how does the switching on or off of multiple tributaries in the upper parts of an estuary impact this, are particularly important in the Humber. And so the images we're going to present in the next few slides are really all depth difference maps. So what we do is we record the maximum depth simulated during the simulation and compare that against a control, if you like. So here's a really good example of the Dyfi, sorry. And what we're seeing here is a comparison between a model simulation with a surge tide and regular fluvial flows, and a surge tide with a large or the largest fluvial event on record. And the red areas up in the top right hand of the screen indicate where you have greater flood depths caused by the fluvial impact. And here we've timed the flood peak from the fluvial end to arrive 10 hours before the surge. And then if we time it to occur 45 minutes before the surge, so the two are occurring at a very similar time, then we can see that these areas of increased water depth and potential for flooding have moved downstream, as we might possibly expect. And we can look at this in the case of the maximum depths along the long profile. So this is the normal long profile maximum depth for a regular tide and regular fluvial flow. Then if we put in a flood event, that bumps up our depths in the upstream area. If we put in the surge only, that bumps up all the depths in all the tidal areas. And when we look at a combination, we can see that this translates our maximum depths further towards the estuary mouth when we have both occurring together at the optimal timing. Now in the Humber we had an interesting slightly different situation, whereby here we could actually switch in we could look at the timing, but also switch in different events. So here we're running the Trent, which is the main river coming in at the base here, which is one of the main tributaries of the Humber. And here we have it with the Trent flooding 12 hours before the storm surge. And here we have it 3 hours before the storm surge. You could, if I flip between the slides, there is a small difference there, but it's not great. So clearly in the larger estuary, we're not getting quite the same importance on the timing, which is intuitive. Now, if we start to add in extra tributaries, we start to see that our area of fluvial influence, if you like, starts to move downstream, as indicated by the arrow. And if we then add in all the major tributaries, we can see it moves even further downstream. Now, what's interesting here as well, that some of you might have picked out, is circled in red on the right-hand side here. We actually have a reduction, a very small reduction in the order of a few centimetres in water depths in the outer estuary. And again, this might seem counterintuitive, but what's actually happening here is we have a greater mass of fluvial water coming down the estuary that is actually acting to slow down the surge tide coming in from the estuary mouth, actually causing a reduction in outer estuary water depths. And if we look at this in a long profile of our max depths, we can see the green line here shows what happens if we have the surge. So the surge impact is felt in the outer estuary. And then if we switch on the River Ouse, in the yellow line, we can see we have an increase in depths in the inner estuary and this decrease in the outer estuary. This wedge of fluvial water coming down is helping to prevent and actually reduce, in effect, flood risk in the outer estuary. And when we switch on more and more tributaries, we can see an amplification of this effect and the movement of the flip over between the increase and the decrease progress downstream. So to kind of summarise this first part, flood timing makes a small difference in the Humber and a big difference in the smaller Dovey estuary, as maybe we might expect. And the combined fluvial hazards can actually shift the zone between increased and actually decreased maximum water depths. And possibly this reflects the fluvial versus tidal domination of the respective systems. So our next quick question was what influence does climate change have? And we can look at this through changes in fluvial inputs, changes in sea level rise, changes in fluvial inputs with sea level rise, and see what surge heights, how that interacts in comparison to sea level rise. So increasing fluvial discharges amplifies the effect we basically just seen. So in the Dovey and the Humber, if we increase the peak of the fluvial flow by 10, 20, 30, 40% here to represent possible increases in flood magnitude represented by climate change, then we start to see an increase in the effect we've just seen before, as in higher upstream water depths, and we continue to get this reduction downstream in the Humber. A straightforward story. If we look at sea level rise on its own, again, a straightforward story. Here we have the Dovey and the Humber both under 1 metre sea level rise, and we have increased areas of flooding in here, largely caused by flood defences being breached in the Humber on the right here. This is including the surge tide, by the way, of these simulations. Now, when we include sea level rise and high fluvial flood events, we start to see a difference. We start to see an amplification of the effects on the fluvial events upstream, in particular with a 50 centimetre sea level rise and the 1 metre sea level rise here. Okay. So downstream or towards the estuary mouth, we start to see a much smaller effect, but the effect is certainly the effect of sea level rise amplifies the effect of large flood events coming down the fluvial system here. Now, these next set of slides are really interesting because what we've managed to carry out here is what happens if we compare a 1 metre sea level rise to a 1 metre increase in the surge height. So we're actually inputting two different types of wave here. With the with an increase in sea level rise, we're effectively making a longer wave with the same maximum input depth, and with a surge tide with a 1 metre increase, we make a steeper wave coming in, and this gives a really interesting effect here. So in the outer estuary, the oranges and the yellows here indicate that the surge tide increases water depth in the outer estuary and all the way up the estuary to a smaller degree, whereas the sea level rise, which has the same actual increase in elevation or the same maximum water surface elevation at the input of the model on the right hand side here, actually causes lower water depths up the estuary but greater inundation on either side. And this reflects the difference between the types of input, with a more aggressive surge, especially a steeper curve, yet a gentler curve but with a greater volume being given by the sea level rise. Okay, and we get a similar effect in the Dovey, which is interesting, but here we also see a topographic effect caused by the tributary, or sorry, caused by railway lines by Dovey Junction, causing this effect to be curtailed as we get to the upper parts of the estuary. And we can see this effect in these two graphs, looking at the sea level rise versus the storm surge height. The same height, remember, in the input, running upstream, running through from 0.25 to 1.25 sea level rise or storm surge inputs, and the dashed lines represent the storm surge increase of the same magnitude, the sea level rise, and we can see the increase in the outer estuary and the less effect on the inner estuary is apparent throughout all of these scenarios. And the same at Dovey Estuary, with this switch around becoming more apparent with the larger increases in either sea level rise or with storm surge. So to kind of wrap up, our sensitivity analysis is what influence does climate change have, and we find that sea level rise leads to an increase in flood inundation, especially above 1 metre. Sea level rise plus the worst case fluvial floods makes a greater increase in inundation, especially the inner estuary and the Humber, and an increase in fluvial flows alone has a smaller impact in the Humber. However, increased storm surge heights result in greater maximum water depths in the outer estuary, whereas sea level rise results in greater areas of inundation or flooding and slightly higher water depths in the inner estuary. And the takeaway from this is that the surge volume or the tidal volume is important to maximum water depths, not just the surge height. And so our final slide, our wrap up, is which drivers are most significant, which is one of the questions we asked at the beginning. So to kind of summarize all this, overall, the magnitude rather than the timing of the fluvial events seems more important. Although in smaller fluvial dominated estuaries like the Dovey, the fluvial flood role is clearly more important and has a greater spatial extent of influence. Whereas in our larger tidal dominated estuaries, such as the Humber, the fluvial flood is important in the upper estuary, but less so in the outer estuary, which is dominated by the tidal and surge tide influence. For climate change, sea level rise is very important, but the sea level rise importantly increases the sensitivity or the vulnerability to combined large fluvial events. And sea level rise results in a very different flood response when compared to the same height increase of a storm surge. Okay. And I think I'll wrap it up there. I've whizzed through it a bit, but we had some time to shave off. Okay?
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. The next and final presentation is Simon Tett, but before we hand over to Simon, just a quick word. If you have logged in and will need to be elsewhere at 12 o'clock, just to confirm that we are recording all of these and all the presentations will be available on the CIRIA website after the event. So Simon, I think we can see your screen. If you unmute yourself, and now over to you. Thank you.
So the project was about playing games to understand multiple hazards and risks from climate change and independent infrastructure, which I will confess is not the best title for a project. But the broad aim of the project was to give a scenario of potential future climate and investigate how that impacted infrastructure in a part of Scotland. So what we wanted to do was use a serious games approach. So this is a game as providing reflective learning, so I might say simulation, to explore climate risk with infrastructure operators. We hoped it would be a fun but a serious way to enable discussion of independent risks between stakeholders. In terms of, say, characterizing risk or hazard, you can see this as one way of inferring what the relevant hazards are. So it's sort of starting from the infrastructure view and saying what are the hazards, so what hazards matter, which was the aim. We wanted to provide access to climate projections in a format that's familiar and accessible to a range of infrastructure holders, so you can see stakeholders. So you can see this as a way of bringing information from the weather and climate field to the infrastructure operators, and then also between the infrastructure operators. Improve connections between organizations and key individuals, allowing a shared understanding of the cross-cutting climate risks and interdependencies. Identify potential cascading impacts. So we were interested in seeing, if one infrastructure element failed, would there be consequences for other or potential consequences, and consider today's infrastructure and future climate. In building this, we also took very much the view that the infrastructure operators who were present, part of stakeholders, understood their infrastructure's vulnerability to weather and climate. So we brought knowledge about weather and climate, they had knowledge about their infrastructure, and the idea of the Curious Game was to bring them together. So just to say, this was a 6-month project. We finished last April and ended up last April 2018. It was focused on Inverclyde. Inverclyde's a region to the west of Glasgow, and has several small towns and cities. In some ways, it's really part of the sort of greater Glasgow urban area. We had stakeholders present from Scottish Transport, Scottish Gas Network, Scottish Water, Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, and Inverclyde Council / Climate Ready Clyde. So a group. What I would say, and I'll reiterate at the end, the key ones we were missing were electricity and telecoms. So I'm going to start with the climate projections and outline briefly what we did to them. I would say that one of our aims was, we were quite clear to the stakeholders that this was not a future. This, they shouldn't think about this as something they should prepare for, but a potential future, a possible future. We used a perturbed physics model ensemble done from the Met Office's regional climate model. That was done for the UK CP09. The approach could easily be repeated on UK CP18. We focused on the 2050s. 30 years from now being a sort of sensible time period for adaptation and investment planning. We had to do some work to correct the errors in the models. But one of the reasons we wanted to use the models was so that spatial information was present, so that one extreme event might be happening in Inverclyde, but there may well be impacts around the rest of Scotland or the UK. So I wanted to make sure that was in it. So here I'm going to go very briefly sort of through 3 example events. So the first one is a heat wave. This shows 5 days, starting in the 28th of July 2054 through to the 2nd of August 2054. The cunning amongst you will notice the 31st of July is missing, and that's because the model uses a 30-day calendar. What's shown here in color is temperatures. So reds are above 24 degrees, dark reds above 27, and the darkest reds above 30. So you can see, in least by Scottish standards, this is an unusual event. We have temperatures around 24 to 27 degrees on average. Other parts of Ireland, it gets up to somewhere near 30 degrees. The blinds, the contour lines are showing pressure. It's, as you might expect, this is effectively a lot of high pressure. There are some dots you'll notice in southern England in July, and 28th of July, that's representing rainfall. So this allows us to construct an event. And then the other part of the story is precipitation. So we mostly focused on temperature and precipitation. And effectively, to do that, we look at the distribution of rainfall from the model in the historical period, and then map that to return periods, and then use the SEPA flood maps to essentially talk about flooding. So where the flooding map would have a 1 in 100-year event or a 1 in 50-year event, we would take essentially, if it's more than 1 in 50, that's going to generate that kind of flooding. Again, that's fairly crude, but given the nature of what we're trying to do, that's important. So this one here shows an example of coastal flooding. And I really wanted to bring this up because it, in a way, this is where we didn't necessarily take the model as it was, but did some modification. So one thing you'll see is starting 18th of 12, 2051, there's a low pressure to the south of England, which basically moves its way up the Irish Sea. That generates a storm surge up in the area we're concerned around, but you'll see associated with that, all these dots, lots of rainfall. So we then took this storm surge and using observational data from Millport, effectively found the highest storm surge in Millport, assumed the timing of this pressure system moving was consistent with the tide to maximize the impact, and then simply added on mean sea level rise in the 2050s, which is about 20 centimeters. Okay, so what we then give the participants is essentially a list of a series of events. They don't know what is to come. They get each event and they have to deal with it. And so they get these event cards. I'll talk about the game in a bit more detail in a moment. So first of all, we tell them this is a 1 in 50-year low pressure event. We try and map it to events that have happened recently. So we say that's a wind and storm surge, at least as high as a series of storms in late December 2011. The combination of global warming induced sea level rise and it being a spring tide leads to unprecedented coastal flooding. So, the text that they get is they're told in the week before Christmas, the intense storm Joe approaches from the southwest. Once centered over the Outer Hebrides, it combines with spring tide to generate a large storm surge up the Firth of Clyde, causing serious flooding. And then this is followed by persistent heavy rainfall causing river flooding on 25th and 26th of December. So that's a combined event. The white blobs here are an idealized map showing where flooding has occurred, and therefore the participants then think about what that does. I'll skip this one. So, but also most of the time, nothing very much of interest happens. Life carries on, so we try and give them something about a scenario of the future. So we say for 2 years, nothing, no extreme events happening in Inverclyde. The summer of 2052 is warm, sunny with low average rainfall. 2053 is fairly dry, getting colder. So again, partly telling them a future story about climate change. And then we might have another event to keep them awake. The next 2 weeks are calmer, temperatures are chilly, a bit of a small drought. So to turn this into a game, we needed to translate infrastructure location into a simple graphical format. We didn't want, nor actually for security reasons, could we give very detailed descriptions of where infrastructure was. But the participants around the game know their infrastructure, so they understand what it's affected by. So we basically start with the map. Here's Inverclyde in more detail. So the main towns are Gourock and Greenock. You can see the Firth of Clyde, Port Glasgow. Out to the north is Dunbartonshire. Glasgow is 50-60 miles, 20 miles or so to the east. You can see there's an urban area. There's some reservoirs, there's some rivers that run down. The main road and rail network runs along the coast, so it's potentially isolatable. So if there's a break, for example, say around Port Glasgow, then communications through to Gourock and Greenock will be hard. There's links to ferries and so on across to southern Argyll to the town of Dunoon. So we then idealize that, working with the graphics studio, to essentially identify the main towns and identify essentially the main nodes of the infrastructure. So we invent wastewater, rail, water, electric power, road, gas, and telecoms. We then give the participants a broader view. So here's a map of Western Scotland showing Glasgow. Here's a map of Scotland, and here's a map of the UK. And partly our aim in doing this is that if a hazardous event happens somewhere else in the UK, this might have implications for Inverclyde. And we made the other arbitrary choice that Western Scotland would be more relevant than Scotland, then the UK. So the way the game works is it works on the idea of an interval, not much happens, recovery, where people recover from events, and then they take notes and identify what has happened. So the event card gets introduced to the players. They then have a discussion within themselves about, well, what was the impact of my infrastructure? And then with each other about the potential impacts of their infrastructure on others. We classify this as disruption, minor damage, or major damage. Again, let the participants decide what those meant. So disruption, we assumed, was generally working, but might be slightly affected. Minor damage would be relatively easy to repair, but wasn't functioning for a while. Major damage would take some time to repair. And then in the recovery period, so after the event, they work out, they decide how much can be recovered and remove these damage tokens. So a long period of recovery gives them plenty of time to recover. And then they're asked to record the overall satisfaction with service, and we ask them to essentially say, are your users and customers happy with what you provided? Did you feel particularly affected by this? And so here's sort of some images of the game happening. We had 12 projects. There were 6 people who were new to the project that we brought in from our partners. So I'd say our partners helped us develop the game, and they also provided participants to explore it as a scenario. It took about 3 hours playing time. We had to rush a little bit of it at the end. And then afterwards, we asked some follow-on questions. And so here shows some of the main things they said. So one of them, one comment was this was seen as a novel approach when compared to a conventional workshop, made the scenario more real, less theoretical. It felt like a good way of discussing interdependencies with other organizations. One person noted that they learned the impact of an organization on the other. Interdependencies weren't actually all that obvious. So one infrastructure operator said they rely heavily on transport, particularly roads and ferries, to access our operational sites. So some conclusions from the game. So the operators felt they could cope with hazards even when they were larger today, and they all felt they would return their infrastructure to normal within weeks. Obvious follow-up is this perhaps needs testing based on the events that have happened recently. There was no evidence of significant cascade failure, so I think none of the operators felt that the infrastructure that they relied on was so damaged that they would have a failure which would in turn cascade. So their view was, at this time, for this kind of climate change, there was no evidence of cascade failures. They could all cope. So some other lessons. The gas and electric networks need early repair of minor roads rather than major roads. So they're dependent on some parts of the road network, which are the minor roads, not the major roads. That electricity and telecommunications is important, and those are missing from our participants. The electricity were signed up early, but we lost them partly over sort of some legal issues. Burst water pipes generated through drought would have some impact on gas supply. Having a representation of events outside the specific region matters, as this would affect the availability of the skilled repair teams. And I think I finish.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. We have a number of questions. Regrettably, Paul Monday has had to leave the webinar, and a couple were addressed to him. What we will do is we'll circulate all the questions to all the speakers after the event, and then we'll collate responses and try and circulate something within a fortnight or so. So we've unmuted now, I think, all of the speakers. So you'll all be on live and contribute to the questions that I'll ask. And I'm aiming to finish no later than 12:30. So the first question, I guess for a couple of the earlier speakers, is to what extent in your research have you interacted with representatives from the insurance sector? So I know that all the projects had industry partners to some degree. To what degree has anyone interacted with the insurance sector here?
For this project, we had no interaction with the insurance sector.
Okay. Any of the other speakers like to come back, or has anyone had interactions with them on your research projects?
In our VTSS, we didn't interact with insurance companies at this stage.
Unfortunately, for our review study, environmental multi-hazard research and risk assessment, we weren't able to. We contacted a number of insurance companies, but we weren't able to take their. They didn't respond positively to our request. So no, we didn't have any insurance representatives in our study.
Okay. Another question from Brian Golding. Has anyone incorporated the recovery time from an initial hazard that increases vulnerability, during which the vulnerability recovers to the pre-hazard level, i.e. the time between one event and the other? And he mentions the recovery time for a hurricane for some island countries has been measured. So I guess that could be for BGS. Was that a factor in your work?
We did not model multi-hazards as such. Therefore, I think the question would possibly be more relevant for speakers that have done this work.
I think from the academic literature, I didn't notice anything generalizing, I think perhaps that would be very context specific in terms of what aspect of vulnerability we were looking at, what the other social context was at the time. But certainly we noted in there the kind of the dynamic nature of vulnerability and thinking about the kind of the importance of consecutive hazards and needing to take that into consideration.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to come in?
Yeah, so in terms of recovery time, because we had these sequence of events, I think in pretty much all the cases we did, the infrastructure operators felt they would be able to recover before the next event came along.
Okay, thank you.
Even in the 2050s, the extreme events don't, well, it depends quite what you mean by an extreme event, of course, but extreme events are still not that frequent, at least in one place.
Okay, thank you. I think the next question was directed towards Tom, and it's from Sarah Jones. Hi, what was the rationale behind choosing a 1 meter sea level rise in the climate change example?
Okay, easy question there. We did a whole range of sea level rises at 0.25 meter intervals, right up to 2.5 meters. All I've done is I've cherry picked slides to show you examples there. It's a 70 slide presentation cut down.
Thank you. Another couple of questions came in about the availability of the BGS report. That is available. If you can't find it on the BGS site, it is available on the ciria.org/NERC, and you should be able to navigate it. If you have any other questions, I think there's time for one or two more. I know a couple were directed at Paul, but I said he has had to leave. There are a couple of points for noting, but they will be sent to the authors. I think we will slowly draw to a close. As I said, recording will be available, ciria.org/NERC. The next event we've begun to plan is we'll probably revisit and extend an event we did earlier in the year on Scour. The information on all the NERC projects can also be found via that ciria.org/NERC page, and we will circulate the responses to the questions within a couple of weeks of this event. So thank you for attending. Apologies for the overrun. I think part of this is we sort of squeezed in the poll, which I hope you found of interest, and we will certainly use that in terms of moving forward. We'll keep you in the loop in terms of any events that we plan on this, so that all remains for me to do is to thank in particular all the speakers for very interesting and very informative presentations, and with that we will now formally close the proceedings. Thank you very much indeed.